ladies and gentlemen, and all incorporated transhuman algorithmic entities as defined by the European Union Court of Human Rights, live from the near future, in association with King Waspinator Studios, and filmed before a live studio audience in beautiful downtown Icon City, Total Party Skills presents yet another episode of America's Next Top Antichrist, with your host, King Krampus. And now here he is, the moment you've all been waiting for, King Krampus.
I feel like I've done this video before, so here we go. Anthony Gramuglia, or however you pronounce his last name, put out a long video about racism and fantasy. So I felt like I needed to bring up that in many ways, the racism that is present in role-playing game fantasy is somewhat, but not entirely related to the cultural and personal opinions that go into the fantasy created by individual writers and authors. There's actually an argument that there's a mechanical reason for the racial stereotypical things to be included in how fantasy role-playing games and role-playing games in general are run. Now, there is a heavy improvisation aspect to a role-playing game where the players have to decide upon their characters' reactions and anything they want their characters to say and do, right? Well, the more familiar they are with the things that their characters are encountering that need less explanation and backstory and exposition dumped on them in the moment by the game master, dungeon master, whatever you're calling it, the better. They know what a goblin is. They know how they're supposed to react to it if they come across a goblin or an orc or a dragon or whatever in a cave. The more esoteric and unfamiliar, the more original the creation, the more the player is not going to know the correct way for their character to operate. This is in part why other genres that have succeeded in role-playing games are often also derived from IP sources like Star Wars and Star Trek, or genres that people are generally familiar with, like cyberpunk, superheroes in comics and stuff like that. Fantasy works, especially for D&D and other beginner games, because of culture, at least in the country where these role-playing games were originally developed. The tropes of fantasy fiction are fairly commonly understood by a lot of people because these are the stories that almost everyone heard and read or were read to and saw movies of as children. Because fantasy has long been somewhat falsely considered to be a, children and maybe young teens type of genre, but not really fit for the adult palate of people who like to read Dostoevsky and stuff like that. So the fact that, generically speaking, your average generic fantasy world is full of creatures from myth and common stories that most of the people who are in your game playing will already have some familiarity with, hopefully, saves a bit of time. So you can throw in a few more original things. It's one of the problems with riffs. Riffs isn't good for first-time role players because there's a lot of stuff in there that's not necessarily like common knowledge culturally. No one knows what the fuck a Splugorth is, kind of a thing. And yeah, you could say the same thing about an aboleth, but there's a lot of other creatures the characters are going to have to fight and become familiar with long before they ever get around to fighting an aboleth in D&D. This use of stereotypes is not only useful for players in terms of the enemies they're facing and knowing how to react to them, whether or not there's a friend-foe distinction that they have to make in a short period of time because they're in a potentially exposed and dangerous scenario. The stereotypes of the various races of Dungeons & Dragons and other similar fantasy genre games are also helpful to players for their characters, because once again, it gives them a basic script. You have some general ideas of what an elf is supposed to be like. That helps you make decisions for your elf character. And once again, the more original and alien the race is in the fantasy game, the more exposition is required for the player to fully understand what those expectations for their portrayal are. orcs being bumped up to a playable race is not actually new. There's always been a bit of mission creep when it comes to players and game masters and authors of books and other media set in and around established role-playing game titles have long had incentive to try to humanize, empathize, and try to explain the perspective of creatures that earlier on are described as just purely monstrous, and then it turns out they're not. Like, much the same in the story structure of how a role-playing game evolves over multiple sessions and multiple levels and multiple adventures. When players first start out, they need to know what the basic stereotypes of the world are so they know how to react. But then as it goes along, then they can start to discover that there's more nuance to that. And then it turns out, like, oh, actually, these goblins, might have some reasons for their, seemingly random attacks on the people surrounding their little shrinking forest and stuff like that. Because why is the forest shrinking? The inclusion of a fallen angel that's trying to redeem himself and become good again, like, how is that bad? The thing I think, like, a lot of left-wing writers in the last decade or so have kind of forgotten on this doom spiral of trying to become, the most infinitely politically correct possible use of language way of writing, is that, you can only subvert tropes if those tropes exist. You can only get people to break stereotypes if those stereotypes exist in the first place. You can only have so many deconstructionist Superman movies before people forget what an actual Superman movie is supposed to be, and all that kind of stuff. D&D can't be nothing but deconstructionist D&D, because then people aren't really going to understand what the hell it is that they're deconstructing once you pass a certain generation. The Palladium fantasy role-playing game back in the 80s had already done a lot of the things that D&D is doing now, in terms of making the playable races more like species that are kind of hard-walled from each other and don't get to interbreed quite so much as they used to. In the olden days of the hobby, when hot orc on elf on human action was permitted, no more. Now you're committing bestiality if you do that. Well, Palladium was already doing that. Palladium also already had, like, most of the core monster races, orcs, goblins, kobolds, ogres, trolls, like, all available as playable races without changing their ranges of limitation on various attributes. And they, still would make a point of saying, 80% of these dudes are probably, aberrant evil or miscreant, but players can be wherever the hell they want. Because, like, the hero who emerges from a dark origin is part of what makes them a hero, is that they stand out from those they come from, kind of a thing. So, like, having a good guy orc in your party it has more impact if the orcs are bad in the world, at least potentially. Unfortunately, because of human limitations of imagination and, like, the long weird history of where the specific mythology that, like, Western classic fantasy tropes are based upon, is largely kind of unknown to most modern people who aren't really educated in such things. Not even intentionally, it's just kind of it's easy to forget. These are little anecdotes for weirdos who like looking into such things. But, you might not realize that the depiction of wizards is, like, actually an outfit they used to make Jews wear and stuff, So, like, let alone goblins and dwarves being anti-Semitic, wizards are anti-Semitic from a certain point of view. And that's sure maybe, like, Tolkien and most of the other people who originated orcs weren't thinking of black people when they were writing about them and coming up with them. They were more thinking about stereotypes of the Mongols, which isn't really much better, but I guess doesn't sting as much in an American context. Really, if you're looking for the stereotype of primitive jungle-dwelling people, then that's lizard people. Easily enslaved by more advanced outside races, but they themselves have some ancient ruined civilization that they've built their villages around, hidden there in the jungles and swamps in their equatorial regions they live in. Like, that's very Congo or Mesoamerican, Brazilian, Amazonian kind of imagery there. So, take that as you will. Is it wrong to want to try to clean some of that up a little bit? No. But neither should you want to clean it up entirely. Because as I said, early on in any game, whether or not the players are experienced, the stereotypes are there for a reason. So that they can understand what the bad guys are and they can understand what their characters are. And then as time goes on, you can stretch your legs and break out of these models. And yeah, like a lot of the basic origins of classic Western fantasy is based on a medieval European model. What else would you expect of the people who wrote a lot of these foundational works? And also, like, there's contradictory standards at play here, considering that also people aren't supposed to try to grift and speak for other people's experiences too much. So, like, is Tolkien supposed to include a modern depiction of black expectations, or is he supposed to ignore it because he's white and doesn't know what he's talking about? Like, even without bringing white supremacy into it, colorism is a thing across a lot of human cultures. And so one can almost say that white supremacy might be a natural outgrowth of that innate colorism that a lot of different human cultures seem to have. Like, I know there's been a lot of effort to, like, describe it scientifically in psychological terms of that people have innate subconscious bias and all that kind of stuff. Well, King Krampus here, back in the King Waspinator studio, doing the editing. Unfortunately, after the horses decided to run up on the property, and I went to go check to make sure they didn't wreck anything, I went back to finish recording my video here, and apparently did not hit the record button. Or it had already been recording, and I hit the off button, because there's like 39 seconds of awkward angled footage of me looking down at my phone. So, what was I saying? Shit. I mean, to finish the point I was in the middle of, there's been a lot of effort to try to, like, scientifically underpin what exactly is going on with human biases, which a lot of people seem to have found insulting, despite the fact that those very same people are now in support of blah, blah, blah. You already know. We're not here for that. I think the simpler way to put it is that as long as we have eyes and the ability to speak, we're going to be able to notice differences between people and things and describe those differences, which is the baseline upon which stereotypes are built when they are then compared with other people's observations. It should be viewed in a more neutral light than we do. We have kind of culturally tried to turn it into the new original sin, instead of just realizing that we don't need any kind of original sin at all, that it's fine. Sin's not real. You can do bad things, but that's different from sin. It's some sort of cosmic eternal stain upon yourself. It should be treated much like how, for instance, we treat our sex lives, as in it should largely be private. I mean, stuff that you only really share with people you're very close with, and largely ignored by the rest of society on a mutual agreement of, like, we're all disgusting animals when the lights are off, kind of a thing. And just so for the sake of everyone mutually saving face, we're just not going to bring this up unless someone's done something really egregious. I don't see why racism can't be treated the same way, but that's not going to happen anytime soon, because it's also tied in a lot with a lot of people's historical narratives and feelings of vendetta. And in a way, role-playing games, and the fact that it has these built-in racial stereotypes about all these various fantasy races, and you see it also in other types of role-playing games, like the vampire games, Werewolf, the Vampire the Masquerade, Mage the Ascension, all the White Wolf games of old They might not have racial stereotypes in the way that D&D has racial stereotypes, but all the sub-factionings of werewolves into tribes and vampires into clans and all that kind of stuff creates another framework of stereotypes for players to be able to kind of navigate around when making choices for what kind of character they want to play. And as they start to understand those stereotypes, they will then also understand, what the other vampires in the setting are like when they encounter them and all that kind of stuff. Like in the way that Star Trek is able to, on occasion, explore real-world allegory by projecting real-world problems between various human subgroups onto alien races. And so that depersonalizes it, so you're not seeing, Palestinians and Jews doing something to each other. You're looking at Cardassians and Bajorans instead. You very much could have the same sort of effect go on in a fantasy role-playing game, and sometimes intentionally, and sometimes it just kind of happens on its own in regards to the very stereotypes of elves and dwarves, like on a cultural level disliking each other, but the player characters becoming best of friends, just like Legolas and Gimli. Like, just because racist behavior is socially unacceptable and should be discouraged because it's very baseline and ignorant and short-sighted, doesn't mean that we have to erase all semblance of stereotype from all of our fiction. We're not going to be left with very much if we turn everything into a gray mass of indistinctiveness. Should there be more fantasy settings based on other mythologies and other parts of the world? Certainly. Some of those do exist, and as time goes on, there will hopefully be more of them. Rome wasn't built overnight, and you can't just immediately undo centuries of publishing companies largely only publishing people from certain demographics, which even then isn't really quite as true. Remember, The Three Musketeers was written by a black guy. That's not exactly fresh, modern, woke standards of authorship and publishing. But regardless of the standards of old and the crimes of old, or however else you want to frame it, in modern times, people are allowed to put out into the world whatever the hell they want and are encouraged to do so. And if it's good and people like it and they resonate with it and they want to play it or they want to read it, then hopefully it will succeed if it's able to find its audience, which in and of itself is still an uphill climb, even with all the social media, since increasingly the process of enshittification means that you still kind of have to pay to play to get by in this world. Anyway, speaking of which, here's an ad for one of my books. And until next time,
stay carbonated.
First of all, what went through my mind is how stupid am I to actually volunteer for this. It was unbelievably painful.